But I'm going to tell you just a little story about why plants have so many different forms of leaves. So you can see right here that everybody's common experience is that there are a lot of different kinds of leaves. They come in different shapes and sizes, and some of them are succulent, and some of them are tubular, and there's all different sorts of things going on there. As it turns out, everybody recognizes a lot of different kinds of leaves. I mean, you don't have to be a trained botanist to recognize most of these, I think. So if I ask you, what's that one right there in the middle? I think we know what that is. But everybody, I think, recognizes this as a fern. What about this one on the right? Holly. I mean, everybody knows this stuff. But and it's surprising when you quiz people on this how many different kinds of leaves that they do know. It's actually a tremendous number. So what's this one on the lower left? And what's this one? What's that one? Oh my God, that's fantastic. Everybody's got it, you know. But the point is that there's a lot of different ones, and we don't usually stop and contemplate this very much. So the question is, why are there all these different kinds of forms? I mean, it's common knowledge. Everybody knows it. We walk past plants every day. Most of the time, by the way, people walk past plants and they don't pay any attention to them. It's an actual term for this called plant blindness. And you guys are all pretty much that way, I think. And yet, you do know these common plants that we just talked about. So you're aware that there's all this diversity in form and the shapes and sizes and everything. But here's one that shows the sizes. So here's one of the largest leaves. It's not the largest leaf, by the way, but it's one of the larger ones, the Victoria Amazonica, this giant water lily in the Amazon. But plants get really tiny, too. This is the smallest flowering plant, so it has tiny, tiny, tiny little leaves, right? So there's orders of magnitude variation, not just shape, but also in size. But it's also the case that leaves don't come in every different kind of form. So, for example, we don't have them looking like California or Kansas. We don't have them looking like Thunderbirds or T-shirts. So there is a ton of different variation out there, lots of diversity, but not everything that you could imagine. Now, the other thing that's common knowledge, I think, is that in particular groups of plants, I'll just show you one, there's variation around a kind of theme. And sometimes the variation is greater than you think it is. So, for example, what are these? Oaks. So these are the kind of common oaks that we have in eastern United States. This one not as common as these other ones, this one less common, and this one you see in the southeast, right? Everybody knows what, you've seen a live oak, for example. Turns out most oak species actually have leaves that look like this. Ours up here are kind of unusual, and I want you to just keep that in mind for a few minutes. So there's variation kind of on a theme, and we can recognize oaks, except maybe not in the extreme forms. Maples provide another good example. So here's the kind of common sugar maple type of thing, red maple, so forth. All of these you recognize as maples. On the other hand, maples is a pretty decent-sized group of plants, and there's a lot of variation in the leaves. You might not know that these are maples. So that doesn't look very much like a maple, especially this one in the lower right-hand side. When I show that to people, they go, that can't be a maple. It doesn't look anything like a maple. But this is a maple from southern China. This is it, in the wild. And you can see it's a maple. So maple leaves can do all different sorts of things, and there's a huge amount of variation, but also a huge amount of variation even within closely related groups of organisms, lots of variation in shapes and sizes. So, and here's another phenomenon that I think you're probably familiar with. So which one of these is a maple? Which one? Which one? The one in the middle. I hear people saying that. So it turns out none of these are maples. That this is a grape. That's a sweet gum. That's a platanus. This is a viburnum. I'm going to return to viburnum in a little while because that's actually a group that I study quite a bit. So some of them have leaves that look like maples. So the bottom line is, the question is, how do we explain all this diversity? And on the whole, people don't think a lot about this. And, even the whole community of botanists who knows about all this sort of stuff, we don't think about it very much. And there's not, as I'll show you, not even very good theory about why we have all of this. Now, what do we do when we're faced with this? One thing that scientists naturally do is think about correlations, and you can get a little ways with that. So, for example, this is an analysis of a whole lot of different plants, every dot in there, from all around the world, sort of saying, what are some of the things that leaf variables vary with? What do they correlate with? And one of the things that's really dead obvious is that really large-sized leaves, like that one at the top, are correlated with large-sized plants. And that's sort of too obvious in a way, right? So you can't have a really tiny little plant with a big leaf that looks like a palm tree, right? So there are some interesting things in here. Larger leaves tend to be associated with larger trees, but also with larger seeds and fruits, with being woody, with having thick leaves and so forth. So there's a whole kind of set of correlations that you can look at there. As it turns out, plants that fall into these two broad categories here. Some of them are what we call acquisitive. They live fast and die young. Others are conservative. They invest in their leaves for the long haul. So we can go a little ways with those kinds of correlations. The other thing I want to tell you about is we have a lot of technology now for sort of quickly measuring leaves and sort of getting a handle on leaf shapes. This is a method that some of us have been using called persistent homology, which allows us to very quickly scan and measure lots of features about these leaves. So we have a sort of elegant sort of technology now for measuring leaf shapes and sizes in some gory detail. And we can see that there's some parts of morphospace that you can imagine that are unoccupied. But a lot of them fall in sort of broad swaths of things that you might expect a leaf to do. A really obvious correlation is with environmental factors, especially with climate. So it turns out if you go to a desert, you will find plants like succulent plants like this one over here, or plants with little tiny leaves, or sometimes plants like cacti with spines. The leaves are turned into spines, or sometimes reflecting a lot of light like this one. Whereas if you contrast that to a tropical rainforest, you go into a tropical rainforest, you get all these big, huge leaves like this, not small, tiny ones. And they also have features like this thing here. Look at this is something we call a drip tip. That's where the water sort of piles up on the big leaf blade and then sort of drips off the tip of the leaf to get rid of it. So we know that when we go to different environments, we see totally different sets of leaves, assemblages of leaves. This is something that we've known about for a long time, and paleobotanists have studied a lot, studying fossils. So you can pick an assemblage of leaves like this one here and say quite a bit about the climate, actually. So if I was sort of plopped, if you just gave me this set of leaves, I could tell you that was a warm, probably tropical forest. If I gave you this set of leaves at the bottom here, I'd say, well, it's probably a temperate forest like what we have around Pennsylvania. And so each of the different kind of climates has a kind of a spectrum of different leaf types. Now, there were a couple of people in 1915, 1916, these guys, Bailey and Sinnott, who realized that there were these correlations and tried to put a finer point on it. And they pointed to one particular thing. It was quite a big discovery, but now we know for sure this is true, is that if you take these leaves like this, we call these entire. They don't have any sort of special things going on the margins. There's no teeth, there's no lobes. This is what we call an entire leaf. This one is lobed, and it also has teeth on it. And what they discovered is that when you go around the world to different floras, there's definite patterns in how many of them are entire. So if you have a very large percentage of your plants in a particular place that have entire leaves, then that's going to be a warm tropical forest, a lowland tropical forest. 90% of the trees in a tropical forest have leaves that look like this, and only 10% have leaves that look like this. And vice versa. If you come to our part of the world, 90% of the plants have leaves that look like this on the right, and very few of them have leaves that look like that. So basically, you can tell the climate of a place by just looking at the leaf margins. You look at the assemblage of plants, and then you can tell what the climate is within limits. So some studies of this, so this is a study, an early study, where each of these dots on this graph is a flora with lots of different trees and other plants. And basically, it's showing that the percent of species with entire leaves, with the smooth margins, if you have a high percentage, it's going to be a warm climate. And you can put a degree on it, like 22 degrees mean annual temperature, something like that. This has been done in many floras around the world. This experiment's been repeated all over the place. It varies a little bit for reasons we don't need to go into from one continent to the next, but in general, there's a very nice regression. The percentage of entire leaves in a community and what the temperature is. And in fact, this is the way people going back in time tell what the temperature was. This is one of the main ways we actually reconstruct temperatures in the past. So if I pick up a fossil flora and I have a bunch of impressions of leaves, I don't even have to know what they are. I just have to get the percentage with entire margins. And in this case, 29%, I can tell you that that was a pretty cold environment. This other one here, if I have 81% with entire margins, that was a tropical forest. So I can tell you within a couple of degrees what the temperature was in the past just by looking at the leaf assemblage. Now, that's an observation, but why? I mean, why does that happen? Why do we have more toothy leaves in our part of the world. And so there's a number of theories. Actually, there's about a dozen theories about this, but I'm just going to mention a couple of them. One is that plants tend to photosynthesize early in the season right around the tips. So when they have little leaf tips like this, little pointed tips, little teeth, that's where they tend to do photosynthesis right off the bat. So one idea is that maybe they're augmenting their carbon budget early in the season in a place that has a short growing season. That's a concept. Another possibility is that these things teeth initially act as what are called hydothodes. They're shunting water out of the leaf, because if they didn't shunt the water out of the leaf early in the spring, the leaf tissue would be flooded and wouldn't function very well. So what they're trying to do is get rid of water coming up from the soil. There's too much water, and they're shunting it out through these leaf teeth. That's another theory. This has been modeled. The main guy who's done this is a guy named Tom Givnish, who was at Princeton when he was a PhD student, and he created an entire modeling exercise about what would be the optimal leaf shape under different conditions. And what he said is under many conditions in temperate zones where you have thin leaves that are kind of thin and not so thick, that the optimal leaf shape would be something triangular like this. And it's something called the support and supply theory that involves supporting the tissue, but also getting water out to the different parts of the tissue. So this was really elegant work. But of course, we rarely see leaves that look like that, so there must be something wrong with this model, right? And he said, yeah, well, there's other things that we need to take into account, like the fact that leaves are functioning on a branch, and if you were all triangular, you'd be overlapping too much, so maybe that's another factor. Anyway, I'm just saying this to say there's a lot of sort of elegant modeling of this stuff. So as a sideline, kind of a hobby for me, I study this group of plants called Viburnum. They're shrubs all around here, all around the building, actually. So they come in many different shapes and sizes, I think you can see. So these are the leaves, each one representing a different species. And so they vary in these features of whether they have lobes like a maple, whether they have teeth like this one. Some of them have no teeth, and some of them are big, and some of them are small. So there's a variety of things going on here. So we thought, well, we could study that and maybe get a little insight into these models and see if we could get at some of the causation of this. The first thing we observed is that in different lineages of Viburnum, this is one lineage, this is another one. These are in Southeast Asia. So in the tropics in Southeast Asia, they have large entire leaves that are evergreen. As you move northward up towards Japan and Korea, the species that are up there have big round leaves with teeth on them. So this fits exactly the realization that Bailey and Sinnott had earlier on. It just totally fits the expectation that as you move into colder climates, you get more teeth. Now, it doesn't tell you why or anything, but at least that's a first step, right? We see that it obeys the rules, basically. Now, when you really look at these plants closely, like I was in Taiwan a couple of years ago, and I noticed on the same plant, two leaves that were right next to one another, this one looking more tropical and this one looking more temperate, and I'm like, oh my God, what's up with that? How can there be this kind of variation within a single plant living in a given spot? And it turns out this is a very common phenomenon called seasonal heteroblasty, and you may never have noticed it, but almost all of our plants here in the Northeast are doing some degree of seasonal heteroblasty. In Viburnum, it's really well expressed. So this is the first leaf that comes out as the branch is growing. This is the second leaf, and this is the third leaf, and you can see there's a change in the morphology of the leaf as the branch is growing, right? And the same is true for this species, and the same is true for this species. They all undergo subtle changes as the branch is growing. So that got us thinking about what's the deal? Some leaves are formed inside the little buds, and those ones that are formed inside the buds and the ones that first come out in the spring along a branch have a different shape than the ones that come out later. So that's what's going on. So what we started thinking about how leaves are packed inside of buds, which is, nobody's ever really studied this very much, but here's a beech tree, and here's a little bit of origami exercise you can do to show that you can take a beech leaf and fold it up around these veins in such a way that it could really be packed very efficiently into a small space in a bud over the winter. So this is a kind of exercise that people have done quite a lot. Well, not quite a lot, not enough actually, but another one that's been worked on is maple. There were some French guys who did a really nice job modeling maple leaf growth out of the bud to the mature leaf. And they also were able to replicate for many different species using this origami or kirigami technique. You can show that how you can fold up. I can actually do this. I do this in a bar over a beer. I learned how to do it. And it's really fun. And you can show people that, if things are lobed or have teeth, you can pack more leaf tissue into a small area. You wouldn't have thought so, but there you go. So we started looking at these viburnum plants in more detail. So around here, this time of year, this is exactly this time of year pretty much, here's a bud, it opens up, and boom, out comes all of this leaf and branch material, and it happens within a week. It's happening right now, all these things, if you go outside, popping, right? My Japanese colleagues tell me, I don't know if I believe this, that you can actually hear this if you're really quiet. You can hear the buds breaking open at this time of year. So check that out. But in the meantime, look, there's a lot of leaf tissue coming out here, and you can see this is one that has teeth and lots of prominent veins and stuff like this. Here's a tropical relative of this one that lives in Borneo, and those buds, they make buds, they rest a little bit, even in the tropics, but they don't have much in them, and they come out really slowly compared to ours. So ours are really sort of adapted to packing a lot of leaves into a small space, and then kaboom, out they come really quickly in the spring. So this is something that isn't the easiest thing in the world to study without. So you could dissect little buds, under a microscope and try to figure this out, and that's how people tried to do it. But it turns out to be easier to use a scanning technique. So this is CT scanning, and this is sort of, you can do a sort of three-dimensional sort of sectioning of a bud, if you will, right? So I'm sort of going down through a particular bud, and I'm seeing how the leaves are folding inside here. These are the bud scales on the outside. These are the leaves. And you can see that they're kind of folding around one another in a kind of complicated dance as they get further down into the bud. And what we discovered about this is that there's actually, the tropical ones are folded in a kind of inefficient way, and the ones up here in the north are folded in a very efficient way, where they're sort of packed around one another very neatly and folded inside the bud. That was our thinking is, okay, there's some sort of shift as you go to the north that you want to pack more leaf material inside your bud, and you do that by getting teeth and lobes and folding around each other in a curious way. We've just started to figure out how to do this in a kind of a, let's see if I can activate this thing here too. So we can now go through these things and actually measure much more about how much leaf tissue is in there exactly. So with the help of some computer scientists, we can sort of section these CT scans and add up how much tissue is actually within there, and then we can do comparisons like between the tropical and the temperate ones. So this is just showing how you can generate that kind of data now. This hasn't been done very much, as a matter of fact. I mean, we're sort of premiering this a little bit, but it could be done very industrial strength now that we've sort of figured out the techniques. And there's a very simple bottom line in this is that we've examined in some detail about 30 species of these viburnums doing these kinds of techniques and making measurements inside of buds. And the main one is shown here that, sure enough, the leaf to bud volume ratio is much higher if you have teeth and leaves. So the tropical ones have very little inside them, basically. There's not much resting in there. The temperate ones, they're just cramming all sorts of leaf tissue in there. And then the idea is you can pop it out really early in the spring and take advantage of that springtime weather, right? This is another measure. We study all sorts of fractal dimensions and stuff. But the bottom line is that there really is a difference between the tropical and the temperate ones, how they're packing leaves inside of buds. So what does this all mean? This is the summary, I guess, of the idea here that we're sort of floating. By the way, we're not sure we're right about this. But the idea is this. I think you're all aware that climates have changed over long periods of time, and they're changing, obviously, recently, like we were just talking about. But since the Eocene, as you move into the Oligocene, let's say 30 million years ago, there was a real change in the climate on the planet where it got colder. So it was much warmer, much more tropical forests and everything. As the climates cooled in the Oligocene and the Miocene and so on, plants and animals had to adapt to the changing climate. And in the case of plants, they went from being evergreen plants that had leaves that looked like this in the tropics to then becoming deciduous plants where they drop their leaves during the winter, right? So that's what we do around here, most of the plants. So they drop their leaves, and what do they end up doing? They end up spending most of their lives as little leaf primordia inside of buds over the winter. So they're spending, 6-8 months or so inside of a bud and getting ready to come out in the spring. So that whole transition from going evergreen to deciduous and living inside of a bud puts a premium on packing the leaf tissue in there really tightly and getting it all packed in there just so. And that has yielded these forms of leaves that we see in the temperate zone with lots of teeth and lobes. So the whole transition from tropics to adapting to these cold climates, becoming deciduous, has generated this premium on bud packing, and that's what yields these kind of leaf that we see in the temperate zone. That's a good story, I think, but whether it's true, we don't know. But isn't it odd? I mean, it's odd to me that nobody knows this kind of stuff, right? Because it just seems so funny. I mean, this is such an obvious thing, and it's not rocket science or anything. So by now, in 2019, we should know the answer to this. But the fact is, we don't, and we're still working on it. We're just trying to encourage people now to say, look inside those little buds, and it's fun and could be enlightening too. And with that, I really want to thank the people who invited me to come, Linda and Annie and so forth. It's my first time coming here, and I'm honored. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Questions? Go ahead.
Linda has one. Oh, yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Jeffrey Hamburger, Cambridge. This was fascinating. In some ways, leaves and buds are just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. And so I was wondering if you could say a few words about the relationship of this particular part of the plant that you study to the rest of these very complex systems, all the way down to the roots. Surely there's some correlations there that might have some bearing on the diversity and shape of leaves. You said a few things, but I'd love to hear more.
Right. So this is a very important point. When people think of leaves, of course, leaves aren't just sitting out there in space or anything. They're on plants, and they're connected to branches, and the branches are connected to trunks, and the trunks are connected to the roots, and so forth. And when people normally have thought about this problem of leaf shape, they're usually thinking about it in terms of water flow through the plant, and also the flow of sap down through the plant, to get to the roots. So plants have a very elaborate system of bringing water up through. They don't pump it up. It just sort of evapotranspirates out the little holes in the leaves, and it brings the water up. So there's a lot of study about how water flows through leaves exactly. But so far, nobody's made a very good connection to these leaf margin traits that I'm talking about. So we've been studying fine venation in the leaves and how water flows out through the stomates, and we can model that, and we have a lot of data on that sort of thing. But it isn't very relatable at this stage to exactly why things would have this or that kind of margin. But this is where a lot of the focus is, because leaves are obviously functional things. They're photosynthesizing, carbon dioxide's coming in through these little holes, water vapor is going out through these little holes. It's all this very complicated thing. I should say, plants are the experts in microfluidics. They're constantly handling the flow of water, And you put one in the shade or in the sun, and all of a sudden they're opening their stomates or closing their stomates. Water is flowing in and out. They're super complicated and wonderful organisms this way. Linda, you.
Linda, Greenhouse, New Haven. So this is a very cool talk. Early in the talk, you presented us with sort of a taxonomic puzzle. So there are maple leaves that don't look like they belong on maples, and there are leaves that look like they belong on maples, but they're not maples.
Right.
So just a basic taxonomic question. So what makes a maple a maple?
Well, the basic answer is because we say so, No, I mean, take maples. Maple is a branch on the tree of life. So the maples are branched off from other plants, which happen to be tropical relatives, actually, and they radiated around the northern hemisphere. There's some 120 species of maples. I'm just making that up a little bit. But basically, what we're trying to do is carve up the tree of life into the individual branches. And then we say, oh, that branch, that's the maple branch. This branch, that's the oak branch. And this is the larches and so forth. So we're trying to carve up the tree of life into these individual branches. And then within those individual branches, over some period of time, stuff happens, and they evolve different leaf shapes and everything. And there is no essential, in a sense, characteristic of a maple. That's the interesting thing. That's the interesting thing about evolution, right? There is no essential character of being a maple. However, we can recognize maples on the basis of things like their fruits. And that's why I showed that picture to say, look at that leaf. It's got the typical maple fruits. So the maple fruits are very conserved during maple evolution. The leaves kind of going all over the place. Yeah.
Barbara Whiteside's in Newton, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
The water in the Mojave Desert this winter has been unlike recent years, as you may know.
Right.
And so the desert is carpeted with green
Right.
and a trillion poppies.
Right.
And depending on the temperature, they are closed if it's cooling for evening
Right.
or opening. Have you, since you're talking about packing, I love to watch them, but the packing in, the folding in of the petals is so incredible. Are there theories about how a plant learns to pack those leaves?
Oh, that's a super good question because, so for example, you may know, I think you know, that the parts of the flower are just modified leaves.
Yeah.
So a petal, like you would see in your poppy or whatever, is a modified leaf. And there's a flower, which is just a modified little branch with a bunch of modified little leaves on it. And this is a packing problem, right? So every flower is coming out like, boom, it's coming out of some little packed state into the mature flower and sort of growing out. So it's the exact same problem. And I hate to tell you, but, well, I'll just say, nobody knows the answers to these things. But poppies, but now that you mention poppies, of course, they're fascinating. You know, the whole poppy lineage, right? The whole poppy, as they've evolved, they do something really special. They crumple up their petals inside the bud like laundry in a laundry basket. It's just crumply. And you've probably watched this. Poppies come out from a crumply state, and then they get these beautiful flowers. So that's one way to solve the problem, just sort of like crumble it up. You know? So anyway, there's a very clear connection there, and we don't know much about how flowers are really folded in this way either.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there's the one over here. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go first.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for opening my eyes to something wonderful. I'm from the Max Planck Institute, Pim Leefeld in Nijmegen, the Netherlands. What is known, if anything, about the genetics of these that drive these shape differences?
Yeah. So not as much as we would hope, but there's whole sets of transcription factors that people have identified that relate to
Two more.
to venation. Things. Oops, I lost my. But it turns out that these margin things, we're just starting to understand the genes that are involved. So there's a bunch of genes there's a particular gene that's been identified called cup-shaped cotyledon that actually turns out to be a key factor in determining whether you get teeth on the margin of a leaf, and the rates of growth of tissue right in that area is controlled by a set of genes. We're starting to understand what those genes are. So far, you know, I mean, we have some model systems, but we haven't expanded it to very broad sets of plants. In plants, you may know, we study just a few things: Arabidopsis, the little weed that we study. We study maize. We study tomato, and we can identify in some of these plants the key genes. But we haven't been able to expand that very broadly. But now, of course, we're sequencing genomes. I have a genome of one of my Viburnums, so we can now fish out the genes that are involved in some of these things. Yeah.
Okay, I think.